Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College, Wheaton, Illinois, and the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. My name is David Capes, and I am the Senior Research Fellow at the Lanier Theological Library and a former dean up there in Wheaton at the School of Biblical and Theological Studies. Our purpose in these podcasts is really very simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it, but to live it. Joining me today on Exegetically Speaking is Dr. Cory Marsh. He's the author of a new book called A Primer on Biblical Literacy. We'll put some notes in the show notes about that so that you can find that book. But he currently is a professor of New Testament out at Southern California Seminary in Southern California, which is, kind of near San Diego, and a scholar in residence at Revolve Bible Church in San Juan Capistrano, California. I love that name, San Juan Capistrano, California. Cory, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. I appreciate you having me on, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
This will be fun. How did you get started reading Greek?
Yeah, you know what? I think back, and I remember a statement that I read, probably published over 100 years ago, from A.T. Robertson, that great 20th century Greek grammarian, who said, the Greek New Testament is the New Testament. All else is translation. And that just really struck with me, and that just stuck with me. And so I was in seminary and doing the normal degree programs, and I got to my MDiv level. And a gentleman that was teaching our Greek there, he was also teaching Hebrew, and he was very unique. He wrote a grammar in both Greek and Hebrew. But I'll remember that first day, I was just like anybody else, starting with the languages and hearing all the stories from people who couldn't do it or were scared about it. I was terrified. And I walked in the classroom, and his name, he's since passed now, is a very dear mentor of mine, Dr. Thomas Rahm. He had said, listen, just do everything that I say, and you'll be just fine. Don't go outside the box. Just do what you can disagree with me later. Just do everything I say, and you'll be fine. And it turned out to be wonderful. And he was able to just really bring the languages out, like Greek, and how relevant it was in the New Testament. In reading the New Testament, it just revolutionized the way I looked at things. Simple words, learning Greek all of a sudden strengthened my English to know categories again, like simple things like the parts of speech and noun and verbs and those types of things. And I remember he went to John chapter 1 and just spent a whole lecture on the imperfect tense of was, the ain there, that the in the beginning was the word, and how that's that imperfect tense, and how just the verb itself can suggest this continual linear fashion, no beginning, no ending, and just that one verb can highly suggest the deity of Christ. And I was just blown away by these ideas. So that was my entry point into Greek, and I just hadn't stopped, since.
Yeah, it's sort of, once you get infected with it, it's hard to stop, isn't it? Well, today we're going to look at John chapter 13. That's what we selected to do, and you've got a kind of an interesting perspective on this, because you've done some deep work in this on your PhD, I guess, and we're going to get a little bit of that in our conversation today. But to set up the context, what are we looking at in John chapter 13?
Sure. What's interesting here, and I think the Greek helps us to understand this a little bit at a deeper level, is the shared mental trauma that the disciples are experiencing in that upper room. Jesus is about to leave. First, he's about to be crucified and leave the disciples, and he's telling them that in John 13. And it's throughout this upper room discourse that the Greek really helps illumine the panic in the room. The disciples are freaking out that Jesus was about to leave them and go back to the Father.
I think it's hard for us to imagine, because we've read these stories so many times. It's hard for us to sort of think about this being a traumatic moment, as you said, that what's happening to them is probably the worst, what feels like the worst case scenario.
Yeah, for sure.
But that comes out in the grammar, doesn't it?
It certainly does. So one of the things about John's personal style, which you wouldn't get in the English, but you do in the Greek, is his use of what we call the historical present verb. This present active indicative third-person singular verb, usually used in verbs of speech and in motion. But John uses it in such a dramatic fashion, far more than the other gospel writers. For example, Luke uses the historical present verb. Luke is more classical Greek. He has traces of Attic, very tight, very elegant. He uses the historical present verb, I think, maybe 11 times, compared to John, who uses it 162 times, I believe, from my last count.
Wow.
And this historical present verb, what it is in the Greek, the form is a present tense, but the way it gets translated in English is a past tense. So when you read in your English text that Jesus said this and Peter said that, you can kind of just gloss right over it without really getting the emphasis of what's happening there. In the Greek, it is Jesus says or is saying this, and Peter says this back to him. It's very vivid. It's very personal.
In a sense, it sort of invites the audience to come in and sit in the upper room itself, doesn't it?
That's right, and that's what's so wonderful about John. His personal idiolect here, his style is it draws the reader in. It's like you're watching a movie, but you're part of the scene itself. And I think it's very intentional in his way of using this verb. He wants the reader to be drawn in and to feel what the disciples are feeling, because in time it's going to lead to that wonderful purpose statement that all these things were written in John 20, verse 31, to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you have life in his name. So even all this collective mental trauma they're experiencing as a group is still to lead them to that part and lead the reader to that we trust in Christ through everything, through all of our panic, through all of our confusion. At the end of the day, Jesus is still stable. He is still the Christ, and there's salvation in him.
It seems like that certainly would have felt like a gut punch, I think, when Jesus begins announcing his departure. And this person that you've come to trust in and to be a part of and to love and to want. We've all lost people in our lives. We've all had people, move or pass away or something. And knowing that was about to happen, I can't help but feel like the disciples were just, as my grandmother used to say, all in a tizzy. I don't know if that translates very well or not, but really verklempt, very upset, right? And that kind of thing. Right. Is there a particular passage here that you would want to highlight or an example of that?
Sure, yeah. We can start in John 13. And it's funny what your grandma said, all in a tizzy. I would say that's right. I would call it a tone of shock can be sensed in this pericope. So in John 13, it's pretty remarkable. The narrative unfolds in the upper room. The disciples respond in confusion, and they're just bewildered over Jesus' departure and death, which he announces, Jesus does, in John 13, 31, and 32. And they're particularly jarred by his statement that follows in verse 33, when Jesus says, "Where I'm going, you cannot come." And you sense this tone of shock in the room. Peter entirely ignores Jesus' command to love one another, which immediately follows in verses 34 and 35. And instead, Peter chooses to respond with two questions of his own that place the focus back on Jesus' departure. Mm-hmm. And the narrative heightens Peter's bewilderment, I think, with questions to Jesus that are fronted by that historical present verb, lege, or he says. Lord, where are you going? In verse 36. And Lord, why can I not follow you? In verse 37. It's like the scene is playing out in front of the reader. And the verb is almost transporting the reader into the narrative itself. And we need to feel this sense of tizzy, as your grandma would say it, among this group. Yeah. And then, if I continue on, then Jesus then predicts Peter's denials in verse 38, which stops him from speaking again for the entire narrative block. It's pretty incredible because Peter's continued silence is deafening. And the reader's left with this somber impression over the angst of this usually brash spokesperson for the group, right? Yeah, and Peter's not going to return in the narrative until he reappears with a sword chopping off ears 5 chapters later. But Jesus quieted him, and he's just stuck in this bewilderment that Christ is leaving and he can't go with him. But he's not the only one. It goes on. We see Thomas also responds, just like Peter in 14:5, with a question of his own to Jesus about his departure from the group and going back to the Father. And just like Peter before him, there's a sense of panic that's inferred, I think, from that historical present verb, that same verb form. The usual focus, generally, when you go to commentaries on this, is on Thomas's question on how do we know the way. And it's usually viewed as merely as a segue to Jesus.
Kind of a setup for Jesus to say, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
That's right.
But it's interesting to me now that you say that, how after Jesus says, "You're not able to go where I'm going," how they keep coming back to that question. They sort of ignore other things. Lord, where are you going? And Simon Peter says, Lord, where are you going? And Thomas says basically, Lord, we don't know where you're going.
That's
that
right.
kind of thing. They're kind of stuck on that, aren't they? Well, when you think about historic and you think about present, they seems like an oxymoron, doesn't it? Historic, it should be past tense. That should be what has happened. And these are clearly things that happened in the past. But the way John tells the story is he wants to bring all of his readers, all of his listeners into that story so that they too can be among those disciples who heard that commandment. A new commandment I give you, love one another.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting how that really doesn't come across in the English translation, because it would be kind of sloppy. Thomas is saying this, Philip is saying this, Peter is saying this, when we know this happened in the past. Right. But bringing in verbal aspect, I think John wants us to see the room as he sees it and draw the reader into this vivid picture. There is panic, and we should be feeling like the disciples. Thomas's question is just like Peter, and Philip as well in 14:8 does the same thing. It fronts the clause. The very first word in the Greek text is lege, that historical present. He says or he speaks. It's almost he's panicking. I think it's really meant to draw the reader into feel like what these guys must have felt like. What would life be like without Jesus in their midst? They got maybe perhaps too familiar with him after 3 years of being with him in the group and leading where they went, and now he's about to leave and they are freaking out. And for the reader, we should feel that sense. Maybe we get too familiar with Jesus at times. And what can life be like if he wasn't with us? We should be feeling the same way. And of course, Jesus is going to tell them to not let your hearts be troubled, which is also interesting in the Greek because that's a singular cardia, heart, but a plural pronoun, your heart. So it's almost like he's talking to the disciples, the nascent church, as being this collective group that share one mind and soul, one heart.
Well, that's a whole nother podcast right there.
It sure is.
That is really cool. Hey, listen, Corey, thanks for being with us. Dr. Cory Marsh, he's the author of A Primer on Biblical Literacy. Go out and get it. It's a great read. It really sets the tone and the table well for becoming more and more biblically literate. Thank you, Dr. Marsh.
Thank you, Dr. Capes. I enjoyed our conversation, and I'm a big fan of Exegetically Speaking, so thank you for having me on today.
Thanks to Ian Rosine, Rebecca Larson, and Silvio Vasquez, who help us produce this podcast. Thanks as well to John Lansma, our Wheaton-based director, who makes this podcast possible. We're grateful to Phil Keggy for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then you need to consider Wheaton College. Whether you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, we have amazing programs, a first-rate faculty, and some of the best students in the world. So go to the website, www.wheaton.edu, and look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. If you have questions about this or any of our podcasts, we'd love to hear from you. If you have suggestions or questions about any passage in the Hebrew Bible or Greek New Testament, send us an email and we'll see if we can get one of our experts to weigh in on that for you. Our email is exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.